If we look at Ayn Rand's four novels in the order that she wrote them, We the Living, Anthem, The Fountainhead, and Atlas Shrugged, we'll notice that I'm going to go through them individually, but we'll notice that the bad guys, the villains in every one of those novels are always collectivists. They're always socialists. And this integrates nicely with the talk that I just gave on the nature of evil. Because Ayn Rand's villains are never criminals, and they're never religionists. They're always modern collectivists. Now, Ayn Rand was a devout atheist, certainly maintained that religion was evil for the reasons I gave in the previous talk, that that reason or the mind is mankind's survival instrument. Religion subordinates the mind to faith, often has burned people at the stake for disagreeing with religious belief. Burn heretics, or the Muslims will chop off your heads. The Jews used to stone you to death, for disagreeing with the specific tenets of their faith. So why no religious villains in Ayn Rand's books? Now, I think to answer these questions, we must master Ayn Rand's novels. We must know the particulars that make up the universe of Ayn Rand's novels, and we need to do this inductively. We need to look at the facts in the stories, and then extract from the facts of each fictitious universe the explanatory principles. So I hope you guys love literature like I do, and especially love Ayn Rand's novels. So let's study Ayn Rand's novels one by one, and master the particulars in the story. We'll go in historical order that she wrote them, and we'll start with We the Living. Now, I just want to editorialize for a second here. We the Living, Ayn Rand's first novel, published in 1936, has been overshadowed by The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, but it is a brilliant, beautiful variation on the traditional love triangle story, and it is just a beautiful and enormously touching story with an outstanding plot. Now, a great work of fiction shows the conflict that results when a character pursuing some goal is opposed by an antagonist or antagonists. And I think the first question a critical reader needs to ask is, who is the main character of a novel or play? Who's the main character of We the Living? In great literature, a main character can be defined as the one principally responsible for advancing the action. The main character, or the conflict. The main character in pursuing a goal clashes with whatever forces oppose that goal. It is his or her value quest that initiates, sustains, and carries to climax the story's central conflict. The main character of We the Living is Kira Ogwanova, and as Ayn Rand stated, this is, to a significant extent, an autobiographical story about a brilliant young girl growing up under the Soviets. Now, Kira's value quest and actions drive the story in We the Living. She wants to study engineering. She dreams of building and designing an aluminum bridge. Despite her family's objection that the profession is inappropriate to a woman, because she aspires to build. She's determined to succeed in her chosen field, although the communist dictatorship opposes her bourgeois background and especially her individualistic principles. It is she who loves, lives with, and seeks to save the life of an aristocrat despised by the state. It is she, when all other values are denied her, seeks to escape from the Soviet Union. She has her own ideas and values. I got to be much more daring now. Now that daring is here to inspire me. But Kira has her own ideas and values. She refuses either to compromise with her family or to capitulate to the state. It is her actions that initiate and sustain the conflict. Logically, the second question is, well, what does she want? In the main action of We the Living, Kira seeks to save the life, both physically and spiritually, of the man she loves. The next question is, who or what stands in her way? Clearly, it is the Soviet state, exemplified by Andrei Taganov, Pavel Sirov, Viktor Dunyev, and Comrade Sonia. The communists forcibly prevent Leo and Kira from emigrating. They expel them from school because of their bourgeois backgrounds and beliefs. They deny the aristocratic Leo access to a sanitarium when he's sick. The collectivist rulers persistently deny their individual rights. When the specific antagonists have been identified, it can be asked, what is the book about in essential terms? What is its central conflict? The answer in We the Living is the struggle of a woman to save the man she loves from the crushing power of a totalitarian state. This is the essence of the book's conflict. But is it its sum? Is the story simply about Kira's quest to save Leo from the communists? Or is there another significant element? Once a story's essential conflict has been identified, it is important to ask whether the total conflict is simple or complex. In We the Living, there is another central element. Andrei Taganov of the GPU, the Soviet Secret Police, forerunner of the KGB. Well, let's call it the KGB from now on. Andrei Taganov of the KGB loves Kira. He is a man unfailingly dedicated to moral principles, but the principles are those of communism. Andrei loves Kira in the teeth of everything he has ever stood, fought, or bled for. A man of principle, though his principles are catastrophically mistaken, he recognizes and responds to Kira's unbending integrity as well as to her physical beauty. And Kira, with no other options open to her, uses Andrei's love to save Leo's life. The author presents a bourgeois woman in love with an aristocrat who, because every door is slammed in her face, uses the love of a communist and of a secret police officer to save her lover's life. This novel tells the startlingly original story of KGB money used in a communist dictatorship to save the life of an aristocrat. This is great stuff. Only Ayn Rand could have come up with this plot. When the full range of the story's conflict has been identified, it is then possible to derive what Ayn Rand terms a novel's plot theme, the essence not of a story's abstract meaning, but of its events or storyline. The plot theme of We the Living is the struggle of a young woman in a communist dictatorship to use the love of a communist to save the life of the aristocrat she loves. The plot theme tells us the what of a novel. What happens? When someone asks what the book is about, this would be the answer. But in serious literature, the reader must still ask the question, so what? What does it mean? What's important about it? What is the author trying to show the audience? The theme, the core of the book's abstract meaning, must be identified. A method of identifying the theme is necessary. Such a method requires the serious reader to shuttle back from the highly essentialized plot theme to the core events and central conflict portrayed in the author's universe. A theme must be induced, that is extracted from the, it's a broad principle, it must be extracted from the observable concretes. The theme must be induced from the observable similarities of a story's events, just as a concept is induced from the things in the world that are observably similar. A theme in literature, much like a concept in epistemology, is a mental integration identifying similar characteristics possessed by a broad range of concretes. What are the main actions of We the Living that form the core concretes of the novel's universe? Kira wants to be a builder, but is prevented by the state. She wants to save Leo's physical life and succeeds only by selling her body after her desperate struggle against the communist state fails. She wants to save his soul, but she cannot, because the crushing weight of the totalitarian system is brought to bear even more fully against the nobility of his character than against that of his birth, leaving him no way to achieve the exalted life appropriate to him. Leo wants to be a philosopher, a scholar, and to write books, but is prevented by the state. Andre wants to love a woman of the bourgeois class, a woman exquisitely principled, but is not permitted by the state. Irina, Kira's cousin, wants to paint beautiful, stylized human figures, but is prevented by the state. Irina and Sasha want to have a life together, but are not permitted by the state. Irina and Sasha want at least to die together, but the communists will not permit even that. Here is the book's main conflict at an abstract level. There are goals that the main characters seek to reach versus some force that prevents them. The ends that an individual strives to achieve, those things that are important and fill his or her life with meaning, are values. And the force in the universe of we the living that prevents those individuals from achieving their values is the Soviet state, communism, or more abstractly, collectivism. The observably similar concretes that unite the core events of the story are the quest for personal values opposed and thwarted by the collectivist state. This insight provides the theme of We the Living. It is values versus collectivism, hence the title. We the living, we the valuers, we the people who have goals and dreams and hopes and aspirations crushed by communism. This book is about human beings' quest to live and love versus the totalitarian state that prevents them. It is helpful to identify the author's own evaluation of her theme. Where does the author stand? In terms of the general theme, does the author support individualism? Does the author support collectivism? Or does she, a la Shakespeare, merely hold up a mirror to life, relating important events, but taking no sides in the moral struggle? We can tell the writer's we can call it a writer's assessment of his own theme, the meaning of the book. And regarding We the Living, the meaning is obvious. Its meaning is the evil of collectivism. Notice somebody could tell the story values versus collectivism, or individuals' values versus collectivism, or the individual versus the collective. Same theme, but the author could support collectivism, right? And believe that collectivist state, where everybody's life belongs to the state and everybody must live for the state. This is the good. An individual must subordinate themselves to the state. And Kira would come across as a villain. She'd be a bad guy because she's selfish, she's individualistic, she's only out for herself. She won't sacrifice for the state. The theme would remain the same, right? Values versus collectivism, or individualism versus collectivism. The plot would be different, and the meaning would be very different. The meaning would then be the glories of collectivism and the evils of individualism. But that's not Ayn Rand. So the meaning of We the Living is the evils of collectivism. Now, Ayn Rand's assessment of her, notice something here, that Ayn Rand's assessment of her own theme necessitates the death of all of the three of the main characters. Ayn Rand, seeking to present, to dramatize, to show the unvarnished truth regarding communism, shows that collectivism, a collectivist dictatorship, permits only four possibilities. You're exterminated by the state, or you can escape the state, or you commit suicide, or you spiritually decay. Two versions of bodily demise, one of spiritual demise, and a tenuous glimmer of hope that one may resuscitate life by gaining freedom. In We the Living, Irina and Sasha are exterminated. Kira is murdered trying to escape. Andre commits suicide, and Leo, the collectivist state's a special target, is spiritually crushed by the ubiquitous, life-stifling policies of collectivism. He loses his reverence for moral principles and becomes a cynical gigolo. Observe that We the Living features Kira, the incipient engineer, and Leo Kovalensky, the would-be philosopher, crushed in different forms by the Soviet state. That's We the Living in a nutshell. Let's move on to Ayn Rand's second novel, Anthem. Now, Anthem was published originally in Great Britain in 1937 and in the United States in 1946. It's what's known as a dystopian novel, showing that the attempts to socially engineer human life and establish a collectivist state where everybody lives, everybody sacrifices themselves for society and lives for the state is doomed to abysmal failure, is doomed to create human misery. Now, let's get the background here. What Ayn Rand shows us in Anthem, and remember, this was published in 1937, a good decade before George Orwell publishes 1984. And I don't know if Orwell had read Anthem or not. Orwell was English, of course, and Anthem was published originally in Great Britain, so it's possible that Orwell did. There's certain similarities between Anthem and 1984, and certain fundamental differences. But the background here is Ayn Rand's writing about an entirely collectivized world of the future. Remember, the year is 1937, the year of publication. National Socialist Germany, the Nazis control Germany, are building up a powerful war machine to conquer the world. The Soviets have been in power in Russia for almost 20 years. The fascists are in power in Italy. The Nazis and the fascists are allies in several years. Ayn Rand could have no way of knowing this, but in several years, in 1939, Hitler and Stalin sign a non-aggression pact. In effect, the Nazis and the Soviets become allies. These collectivist dictatorships literally threatening to swallow up the world. Civilization, freedom and civilization are in grave danger in the world that Ayn Rand publishes Anthem in. So she's writing about a totally collectivist state of the future. There's no free country everywhere. The Nazis or communists have conquered the entire world. There's only socialism, full socialism. There's no freedom, there's no individual rights, there's no capitalism anywhere on earth. Now, what Ayn Rand shows us here, and this is a sharp difference with 1984, what Ayn Rand shows us here is that a totally collectivist world regresses into primitivism. There's no electricity, there's no cars or planes, they live by candlelight. They've lost the knowledge of the freer eras of the past in the same way it's a dark age of the future. In the same way that the dark age, the European dark age of from the 5th to the 9th centuries AD lost the knowledge of that the Greeks and the Romans had developed, and they lived in a state where people were ignorant. There's a complete dark age regresses into primitivism, very, very low material standard of living, and the life expectancy is in the 40s. Furthermore, the most original and striking thing about Anthem that sets it apart from all the other anti-collectivist dystopian novels is the original use of the language. Ayn Rand portrays a world in which all first-person references have been expunged or deleted. There's no word I, there's no word me, there's no word to signify an individual. We refer to ourselves as we. As Andrew Bernstein, I'm we. Well, where's everybody else? No. In other words, the collectivists here have not only socialized the body, it's not just that we toil for the workers' state. They have now socialized or collectivized the mind. We can't even think of ourselves as individuals. All first-person references to individuality have been deleted from the language. Now, this is startlingly original, and Ayn Rand's showing full collectivism here, the collectivization of the mind as well as the body. Now, who's the main character here? Notice the name, Equality 27521. His name isn't really a name, it's a term of propaganda, and notice the numbers following when it's signifying how many people have this name. Now, what does equality want? And this is a brilliant novelette. I mean, Anthem's about 120 pages. You could read it in about 2 hours. It's just a beautiful little story. What does Equality want? He's a very, very bright guy. From childhood, he wants to be a scientist. He wants to study the nature of things. But he's always asking his teachers questions. He asks too many questions. His mind is too bright, too active. They whip him. You know, he's always beaten for asking too many questions, wanting to know too much, being insubordinate. And when he comes to be a teenager and they're going to assign him to the collectivist rulers assign him to his lifetime task, they assign him street sweeper, the lowest menial task they could find. Not because they fail to recognize that this is a brilliant kid, but because they do recognize that he's a brilliant kid and they're afraid of his intelligence. That if he's living the life of a scientist, of a thinker, you know, he might do more than discover truths of nature. He might, if he's an intellectual, he might use his mind to raise questions regarding the moral rectitude of the dictator's regime. They want him doing manual labor, not thinking. So he's stifled by the state. But as a street sweeper, he discovers, you know, from the old unmentionable times, on the edge of the city, this tunnel that, you know, that is actually is a subway tunnel, although he has no way of knowing that. And he sneaks away at night to do scientific research, perform experiments, and in time, he reinvents the electric light in a society that's just recently moved from torches to candles. Equality is a Thomas Edison of the future, reinventing the electric light. He's captured by the collectivist rulers. They capture him. They're gonna kill him, and they're gonna destroy the light. Why are they gonna kill him? They're killing him for acting independently because he refuses to obey. He refuses to subordinate himself to their dictates. He's thinking independently. He's living by his own judgment, and consequently, he's a threat to rile up other citizens of the state against the rulers. So they're killing him for his independence. But he escapes into the wilderness. He's joined by other independent minds, including his girlfriend, who he calls the Golden One. He discovers a book, a house in the wilderness from the old unmentionable times that has books in it, and he rediscovers the word I. And it just hits him like an intellectual, emotional ton of bricks what that word means, the concepts of individuality. Now, the essence of the conflict in Anthem is equality seeks to study science. The collectivist dictatorship, terrified of his mind, seeks to stifle him. So the plot theme of Anthem is a young scientist reinvents electric light in the dark age of a future totalitarian state. Now, what does this all mean? What are the key events of the story that will enable us to induce the novel's theme? Equality, who desires to be a scientist, is repressed by the collectivist dictatorship. Neither equality nor any other person is permitted to choose a friend or a lover. The state bans this as the sin of preference. Everyone must be equal in value to equality or anyone else. No friends, no lover. We're all of equal value. Equality cannot think of himself as an individual. First-person references have been deleted. I is an unknown and unmentionable word. When he was a child, somebody had rediscovered that word and uttered it, and they had ripped his tongue out. The collectivist dictators had ripped his tongue out, burnt him at the stake, and made everybody in the village watch. And Equality, as a young child, watched this, and he thinks of the victim as the saint of the pyre. You know, that the victim was some kind of hero, but he doesn't know why. He doesn't know what the unmentionable word was for which the saint of the pyre had his tongue ripped out and burned at the stake. So there's no romantic love. There's only state-controlled breeding. Equality escapes, rediscovers the unmentionable word of I. Now, this complex of events shows us a society repressing individuality completely, not just physically, but intellectually and morally. Equality does not merely reinvent the electric light. More fundamentally, in an utterly repressive collectivist dictatorship, he rediscovers the concepts of individuality. This is what's so original about Anthem. He rediscovers the concepts of individuality. And this is the theme of Anthem, the rediscovery of individuality. Ayn Rand's assessment of her own theme here could not be clearer. The novel's meaning is the glory of individualism and the stiflingly suppressive nature of consistent, undiluted collectivism. In Anthem, we see a brilliant scientist triumphing both materially and intellectually over a repressive collectivist dictatorship. This is the first of Ayn Rand's two masterpieces. The main character is Howard Roark. Now, the setting is New York City, Ayn Rand's adopted hometown. Of course, she was born in Russia in 1905, educated under the Soviets, escapes from the Soviet Union in 1926, comes to New York City, her favorite city. She loved the New York City skyline, and the Fountainhead at one level is an ode, a love poem to the brilliant architects who designed those skyscrapers. And the main character is Howard Roark. Now, he is the one who designs in accordance with his own principles. He leaves the Stanford Institute of Technology rather than wait to come back the next year after being expelled to work for Henry Cameron. Roark refuses to compromise his design for the Manhattan Bank building, although he's very poor and he needs the money. He designs the Stoddard Temple in accordance with his principles, although they clash with conventional understanding of what a building should be. Roark is the one who changes the life of Dominique Franken, of Stephen Mallory, of Gail Winand. He's the one who stands on principle, who refuses to compromise his values, who succeeds and on his own terms. Roark dominates the conflict of this story. And one day I'm going to write an essay on Howard Roark as the greatest hero in world literature. I think of this as the Roark principle. No hero who's at the observable level of action throughout the story, because I guess we have to distinguish him from John Galt and Atlas Shrugged. No hero who's at the observable level of action throughout the entire story, like Howard Roark is, completely dominates the universe of his story the way Roark does. Now, what does he want? He wants commercial success in architecture and on his own terms. Above all, on his own terms. He is not going to compromise. Roark has a vision of what a building should look like, and he is not going to compromise on this. You know who's a real life entrepreneurial example of this in recent years? Was Steve Jobs. Did anybody see the recent Steve Jobs movie with Michael Fassbender and Kate Winslet? Now, it spends a lot of time. It's based on Walter Isaacson's biography, which is the most accurate biography of Steve Jobs we have. It spends a lot of time showing what a messy personal life Jobs lived and his denial of paternity with his daughter. But it shows a good 50% of the movie is focused on Jobs' professional life and on his unbending integrity, his vision of what a computer is and should be, and his refusal to compromise on this, to the point of getting fired from his own company. He got kicked out of his own company because of this. That Jobs had a vision. I don't know if I could use the language that Jobs himself used. Jobs saw a computer as akin to a work of art. It's a work of art. And what he says throughout the story? Computers is a work of art. He says all the time, things like, Leonardo doesn't ask the viewers of a painting what goes in the painting. Mozart doesn't ask the audience what notes go in here. And similarly, we shouldn't be thinking about what the customers want in a computer. We're the artists. We're the experts. We know what makes a great computer. And then hopefully the customers, responded. But he had this vision of what a computer would be, and he was completely uncompromising in putting it into practice. And it took 25 years, for the marketplace, or maybe more. It was from the early 70s to the late 90s. It took a good 25 years for the marketplace to catch up with Jobs' vision of what a computer should be. And eventually, of course, he achieved great commercial success when the marketplace caught up with what his vision of what a computer was. And now Howard Roark, many years before that in fiction, lives out the same story. He refused to compromise on what his vision of a building could be. He's way ahead of his time. The public don't agree with him at first, and it takes years, decades for them to accept the revolutionary modern designs that Roark built. Now, he wants commercial success in architecture and on his own terms. Above all, on his own terms. Again, another thing Roark reminds me of, whenever I hear Sinatra sing My Way, this is the story of Howard Roark, right? I did it my way. I went through all these obstacles, fought all these battles, got knocked down, got back up, eventually succeeded, and I did it my way. Now, who or what stands in Roark's way? Several antagonists. First of all, a conservative society that prefers traditional designs and wants Roark to conform to the designs of the past. Roark's a modernist. He wants to build glass skyscrapers. He's got revolutionary designs. But society's not used to that. They want designs that conform to the buildings of the past, and Roark won't give it to them. Above all, though, the main villain here is the Marxist, intellectual, and architectural critic Ellsworth Toohey. Toohey wants Roark to obey. Toohey seeks to establish a socialist state in the United States. He's a communist. He's a Marxist intellectual. Toohey is working to establish a communist state in the United States and to break the independent thinkers. And Toohey has great social power. He has great political power. He brings legal charges against Roark, brings him into court twice, attempting to wreck Roark's career. Roark, however, will neither conform to social prejudices nor obey the state. Like Socrates, like Thomas More, like Galileo, like Ayn Rand herself, like many other independent thinkers, Roark stands on principle, on the truth as he sees it, and on his own unique vision. Now, the plot theme of The Fountainhead is the struggle of a young architect against tradition and socialism to win acceptance for his revolutionary ideas. Now, who are the other main players, and what are their actions that form the core events of The Fountainhead? Peter Keating seeks commercial success in architecture by conforming to the desires of clients, by copying the ideas of others, by currying favor with those in authority, like Ellsworth Toohey, and by getting Roark to do his work. Keating is utterly dependent in thought and action, and in the end, is publicly and properly exposed as a fraud. Keating's another main player in the story, along with Roark. Now, Ellsworth Toohey seeks power both spiritually and politically. He's a cult leader at one level and a Marxist intellectual pursuing the power in a socialist state. He has so many followers, he says he brushes them out of his hair. Above all, he seeks to wreck Roark's career. His main field is architectural criticism. He can't have this independent architect in his own field thinking for himself, or just thinking and gaining cultural influence. People want to be like Roark, independent thinkers, whereas Toohey wants a socialist state where everybody obeys. So Toohey is even more parasitical than Keating, utterly dependent on his victims and followers. Now, Dominique Franken, Roark's lover and future wife, recognizes that Peter Keating, despite all the acclaim he received socially, is a mediocre architect. She recognizes that Howard Roark, despite social rejection, is a genius. Dominique recognizes that Ellsworth Toohey, despite being sainted by society, is a power-lusting monster. Dominique Franken is not a follower of the crowd. She sees with her own eyes, she understands with her own mind, she's an independent thinker. But she has made a critical error. She is terribly pessimistic. She thinks society is so evil and so rotten that the Keatings and the Tuohys are going to inevitably rise and the Roarks of the world will be crushed. But, being an independent thinker, she's looking with her own eyes, seeing with her own, understanding with her own mind, and she observes events. She sees Peter Keating's destroyed, and destroyed because he's dishonest. She sees that Ellsworth Toohey is defeated, and defeated because he's completely dependent on the crowd. She sees that Howard Roark can't be stopped, and can't be stopped because he's independent and highly moral. And she changes her mind. She comes to realize that the world was not nearly as bad as she thought it was, that the Roarks of the world can and will succeed, and she's free of her fears, and now by the end of the story, she's able to live happily with the man she loves. In her character, Ayn Rand defines Dominique Franken as herself, Ayn Rand, in a bad mood. You know, an independent thinker who in her worst moments, in a bad mood, believes that the world is corrupt and evil and it's hopeless for the good to triumph. Now, in the character of Dominique Franken, Ayn Rand shows us that independent judgment, thinking for yourself, going by facts and reason, not following the crowd, although not infallible, Dominique was critically mistaken in the beginning, that independent judgment is a self-correcting mechanism. That the independent thinker is the one who goes by the facts, doesn't follow society, doesn't follow the crowd. And by observing the facts, Dominique's able to see the truth and change her mind. So that independent judgment is a method. It's not a content, it's not a theory or belief. It's a method of using one's mind. And independent judgment, although not infallible, nothing will make us infallible, is a self-correcting mechanism that allows us to correct our errors. Now, such core actions and others provides us with the theme of the fountainhead. And the theme of the fountainhead is independence versus dependence in thought and action. I love Ayn Rand's statement of her own theme. It's brilliant. Ayn Rand said the theme of the fountainhead was individualism versus collectivism, not in politics, but in men's souls. I mean, that's just a brilliant formulation of her own theme. The theme of the fountainhead, Ayn Rand said, was individualism versus collectivism, not in politics, but in men's souls. And that's exactly right. The fountainhead is about conducting my life in accordance with my own judgment versus, that is being an individualist, versus letting my life be dominated by other people. That is being a collectivist of the soul. Now, Ayn Rand's appraisal of her theme in this novel is clear. The book's meaning is the life-giving virtue of independence and the terrible danger of surrendering one's mind and life to others. All right, now one more novel. How many people here have read Atlas Shrugged? Yes, all right. The greatest novel ever written. I'll stand by that judgment till the day I die. Now, Atlas Shrugged is a mystery. We can go on discussing Atlas Shrugged for months, but I assume you do that in Professor Orbaugh's class, right? It's a mystery. Now, in analyzing it, I will necessarily give away the solution to the mystery. So for those of you who haven't read Atlas Shrugged, you're gonna, the solution to the mystery is going to be provided here. But people read Atlas Shrugged 5 times, 6 times, many times, and every time after the first time, they know the mystery, they know the solution. It doesn't undermine their ability to enjoy the story, right? Part of the amazing, just eye-popping, mind-boggling plot structure of Atlas Shrugged, unprecedented plot structure of Atlas Shrugged, is the main character who dominates the action, who completely, utterly, and totally dominates the action, is completely behind the scenes for fully 2/3 of the story. Pulling the strings, making things happen. The primary narrator here, Dagny Taggart, doesn't know he exists. She suspects it, but she doesn't know. But the main character for a 1,000-page novel, behind the scenes, unbeknownst to the narrator, and consequently unbeknownst to the reader, dominating the action. I don't know in the whole history of literature, I don't know of any such plot story or plot device. Now, Galt, Atlas Shrugged is a novel about a strike, right? It's the men of the mind on strike. It's Galt who conceives of the strike. It's Galt who initiates the strike of the men of the mind. Galt is the one who forms the plan to put an end to the evil destroying human society. It's Galt who vows to stop the murder of the world, and does. It's Galt who leads the strike. It's Galt who announces the strikers' demands on national radio. It's Galt who decides when the strike ends and the strikers return to the world. He dominates the action. Amazingly, although for a full 2/3 of the story, he's behind the scenes. Now, what does he want? He seeks to establish a society in which the principle of individual rights is consistently implemented, enabling mankind's best minds to create vast amounts of intellectual material wealth. Who or what stands in his way? A state actuated by the altruist, collectivist, statist philosophy, a philosophy of self-sacrifice, of the supremacy of the state over the individual, of the necessity to perform selfless service to the state. What stands in his way is a philosophy animating the culture and the government of his day, a philosophy driving the United States into the collectivist dictatorship of communism or fascism. John Galt takes out on strike all of the thinkers, the great creative minds, leaving the collectivist state to collapse into the poverty and misery that all collectivist states relapse into. Notice North Korea, for example. Now, the plot theme, Ayn Rand identified it brilliantly in the Romantic Manifesto, is the men of the mind go on strike against an altruist, collectivist, statist society. John Galt and his allies create a free society in which the thinkers are free to create vast amounts of wealth. Notice that in Galt's revolutionary motor powers the electricity, and the screen that keeps them hidden from the outside world. By contrast, outside of Galt's Gulch, outside of this free society hidden away in the Colorado Rockies, the collectivist dictatorship establishes a repressive state in which the mind is stifled and the U.S. collapses into the terrible poverty of all collectivist dictatorships. So notice something. By both the mind's freedom in Galt's Gulch and by its repression in the outside world in the collectivist dictatorship, by both the mind's presence and its absence, the mind active in Galt's Gulch, the mind has been withdrawn from the outer world. By both the mind's presence and its absence, Ayn Rand shows the mind's role in human life. And she also shows the mind's necessity of political economic freedom. When the mind is free, it creates great wealth. Like during the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution in Britain and the United States, for example, when the mind is repressed, whether it's under the communists or the Dark Age religious state, when the mind is repressed, you see Dark Ages and the collapse into terrible poverty. Now, notice also during before the United States in the world of Atlas Shrugged is moving across the political spectrum from a mixed economy with some elements of freedom left into a total dictatorship. In the freer days of the U.S. mixed economy, early in the story, notice there's enough freedom there that Hank Rearden still owns Rearden Steel. Dagny Taggart's still free to run Taggart Transcontinental. And Rearden, of course, creates Rearden Metal. In the freer days of the U.S. mixed economy, Rearden creates Rearden Metal, which improves upon steel in the way steel improved upon iron. Dagny builds a line out of Rearden Metal. The state of Colorado becomes an enormously productive industrial state in the freer days of the U.S. mixed economy. Now, freedom of the mind, Ayn Rand showing us, leads to the vast creation of. I should mention at least one artist here. Richard Halley, of course, composes brilliant symphonies and operas in the freer days of America's mixed economy. And so Ayn Rand showing us that when there's at least some freedom of the mind, it leads to the creation of vast amounts of intellectual and material wealth. But when the thinkers are withdrawn, as the totalitarian curtain descends fully, the U.S. plunges into poverty, rivaling the Soviet Union and other communist systems. So it's stunning in Atlas Shrugged, the contrast of the mind's freedom in Galt's Gulch and semi-freedom in the earlier days, freer days of the U.S. mixed economy, the contrast with the full repression, the full collectivist dictatorship. And this contrast between the mind's freedom or semi-freedom and the mind's repression gives us the novel's theme, the role of the mind in human life. That the mind is the means by which we create all the values that life depends on. And the sub-theme here, the mind's non-negotiable need of political economic freedom, the mind's need of the principle of individual rights. Again, Ayn Rand's judgment regarding her own theme is very clear. The meaning of Atlas Shrugged is the mind's indispensable role in promoting human life and its non-negotiable requirement of freedom. So to summarize, Atlas Shrugged tells the story of the great thinkers on strike against an altruist collectivist code of selfless service to the state. The great thinkers on strike against a collectivist dictatorship. Now, Ayn Rand's villains in every one of the four novels are collectivists and collectivism in different forms. In We the Living, the villain here, the antagonist, is the Soviet state, communism. In Anthem, the villain or the antagonist is a fully consistent collectivism of the future. In The Fountainhead, the primary villain is a Marxist intellectual seeking to impose communism in America. And in Atlas Shrugged, the villains here represent the U.S. mixed economy collapsing into a full collectivist dictatorship. Now, notice an interesting point here. The virulence or degree of collectivist dictatorship faced by the heroes. The virulence of collectivism, the degree of its development or evil. The degree of the collectivist dictatorship faced by the heroes. Now, I wrote published an essay on the freedom gradient in Ayn Rand's novels. And go along the freedom gradient from the most repressed society faced by Ayn Rand's heroes to the least repressed society faced by Ayn Rand's heroes. And the most repressed is in Anthem, where Anthem presents the most fully developed collectivist dictatorship. It's a collectivist dictatorship that one, controls the world completely with no freedom anywhere, and two, has done so for a long time. Ayn Rand doesn't specify how long, but it's a long time. Decades, generations, maybe even centuries. I'm not sure. But it's a fully developed collectivist dictatorship. Equality of Ayn Rand's heroes, equality faces the most brutally repressive totalitarian state. Now, We the Living, second most repressed collectivist dictatorship in Ayn Rand's four novels. We the Living presents this is 1920, the Soviet regime has just been established. They're still consolidating power. This is a very recent development. We the Living presents a totalitarian state just established. There are still elements of freedom. The new economic policy permits some degree of private ownership, and it allows some elements of business. And so the communists are still consolidating power in We the Living, but it's an almost fully developed totalitarian state. And Kira and Leo they're captured trying to escape, and then Leo is spiritually crushed by this state. He's an aristocrat, and his father, Admiral Kovalensky, was executed for counter-revolutionary activities. He is the special target of the communist state, and they crush him, leaving Kira no other choice but to try to escape. They've already expelled her from school. She can't be an engineer. They've spiritually crushed the man she loves. All she can do is try to escape, and they shoot her when she tries to cross the border. But this is the second most repressive dictatorship, not quite as developed as the one in Anthem, and also in We the Living, it's the Soviet state. There's still freedom outside the Soviet borders that Kira could try to escape to. In Anthem, it's a completely collectivist world. Now, Atlas Shrugged, the third most repressive society faced by Ayn Rand's heroes, or the second freest, because in the early days of the story takes place over about 12 years. In the early days of the story, there's still some elements of freedom in the U.S. mixed economy. Like I said, Reardon still owns Reardon Steel, Dagny still runs Taggart Transcontinental Railroad. For most of the story, some element of freedom remains. It's only at the end that the United States collapses into a full collectivist dictatorship. Now, in The Fountainhead is by far, Howard Roark lives in by far the freest society of any of Ayn Rand's novels. It's the U.S. mixed economy of the 1920s and 1930s, which even when FDR's in power in the 1930s, there's still significant elements of political economic freedom in the United States, and Roark lives in a basically free society, but with a major Marxist intellectual politico who's got tremendous social and political power seeking to impose communism in the United States. But the political economic system of The Fountainhead is by far the freest society in the four novels, in the universes of Ayn Rand's four novels. Now, my essay on the freedom gradient in Ayn Rand's novels goes off in a different direction than this talk, but it's interesting in the degree of freedom versus the degree of repression in these societies, in what kind of obstacles this places in the path of the hero's quest to achieve their values. Now, notice, so collectivism is always the villain. Notice that the men of the mind are always the hero. In We the Living, Kira, who's a young, outstanding student who, like Dagny Taggart, if Kira lived in America, would be a brilliant engineer and design the aluminum bridges that she dreams of. Leo Kovalensky, the philosopher in training, the scholar he would be, but an aristocrat, the son of a man executed for counter-revolutionary activities, the especial target of the workers' state, all his hopes, dreams, aspirations snuffed out by the communists. So these incipient, or would-be, these brilliant young people who would be brilliant engineer or philosopher if they lived in a free country. Again, you see the mind. Anthem, equality, is a brilliant scientist. He's a Thomas Edison of the future. The Fountainhead, Howard Roark, brilliant architect in the modernist school, like Frank Lloyd Wright, like Warren Orbaugh. Atlas Shrugged, above all, John Galt, the Renaissance man genius, the brilliant philosopher, the brilliant scientist, the revolutionary statesman. I mean, John Galt is like Aristotle, Newton, and Thomas Jefferson rolled into one. He's just an extraordinary genius, a Renaissance man. So the essential conflict in all of Ayn Rand's novels in differing forms is the men of the mind, or men and women of the mind, versus collectivism. Now, let me close this and we go to Q&A. Why are the collectivists always the villains? I mean, after the talk I gave just an hour or so ago, I think this should be fairly clear. But so we could do this quickly. Why are the collectivists always the villains? I mean, given the evils of religion, why are there no religious villains in her novels? It's striking, isn't it? If you study the corpus of Ayn Rand's novels, religion is not there in almost any form. Not only are there no religious villains, there are hardly any religious characters. You have to dig to find somebody who's remotely religious. In We the Living, Kira's sister, Lydia, is harmless. She's given the repression of the communists, she reverts to faith and belief in a better world to come, and she lights her candles and prays to her icons. But she's a harmless person. She's not evil. She's not going to burn. If she had the power, she's not going to burn somebody at the stake for disagreeing with her Russian Orthodox, principles. You struggle to find religion. In the Fountainhead, Hopton Stoddard is vaguely religious. He wants to build a temple. It's very attenuated in any existence in Ayn Rand's novels. Never mind in villainy. Now, I think there's two reasons for this. The one is contextual, and one is, I think, an absolute moral sense that I discussed in the previous talk. Contextually, in the 20th century Western world that Ayn Rand lived, she emigrated to the United States and lived there her whole life. I don't think she ever left the country after she arrived in 1926. I don't think Ayn Rand ever left the United States from 1926 to 1982. And she certainly never went back to Russia. But in the 20th century Western world, collectivism has vastly more political power than does religion in the West. Politically, religion was defanged in the West by the rational principles of the Enlightenment. And notice the principle of religious freedom articulated by James Madison, the First Amendment, the Bill of Rights, the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. The first clause of the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution reads, quote, "Congress shall make no laws respecting an establishment of religion, comma, or restricting the free exercise thereof." Period. Unquote. Now that is revolutionary. That there'll be no official state-backed religion in this country that can impose this particular religion on the citizens. The citizens choose their religion, they could choose not to be religious. It occurred to me a couple of years ago what the American founders, and props to Thomas Jefferson and above all James Madison on this, who stood strongly for religious freedom. What the American founders did was they privatized religion. I mean, that's really, they privatized religion. Religion is a matter of personal conscience. And that principle spread throughout the Western world in the 19th century. Religion has no political power. Now, in the West, in the United States and in Western Europe. Now, if Ayn Rand were living in medieval times, or if she were living in the Arab Islamic world today, religion would be, in that context, would be the greatest menace to the mind in that world. And if she were to write novels, I presumably she wouldn't publish them, but if she were to write novels, presumably the villains would be religious leaders who burn at the stake the Howard Rocks and the Equalities and the Dagny Taggarts, and the Kira Ogwenovas et al. But in the context in which Ayn Rand was writing in the 1930s and the 1940s and the 1950s, National Socialism in the 1930s and communism in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. These were the major menace to the mind in that political context in the West in that era. But there's a second reason, and we already discussed it. It's not the second reason why the villains are all modern collectivists and not religious, and that is collectivism is more evil than religion in an absolute sense. And we discussed this already, so we could just do this briefly. Notice, as several examples, there was a medieval Renaissance in the West. Thomas Aquinas, Albertus Magnus, leading to the Italian Renaissance. That is when Catholicism was still a dominant cultural force in Europe. There was a significant medieval Renaissance that, that survived under the church. Similarly, there was a great golden age of Islam, roughly 800 to 1200 AD, in which great minds like Al-Razi and Avicenna and Averroes made tremendous advances in any number of fields when Islam was a dominant cultural force. So that it is, for the reasons I gave in the previous talk about religion's reverence for the individual soul and the integrity of one's own soul. For reasons like that, there have been and can be renaissances and golden ages under religion, although it's always tenuous. I mean, what ultimately ended the golden age of Islam? Islam, right? They burned the books, etc. So it's always in danger. But these things do happen. It's possible. As I mentioned earlier, there's no golden age under National Socialism. There's no golden age of communism. There's no golden age possible under these collectivist systems because they don't have any respect for the individual soul or the individual mind. They loathe it, they hate it, they anathematize it, and they kill it. The mind is completely crushed under the Nazis and the communists. The only thing you could do is rebel or escape. So, collectivism is the worst evil and the gravest danger the mind has ever faced. So, let me conclude here. So, I think for two reasons. If the men and women of the mind are going to be the heroes in the novel, that if the men and women of the mind are going to be the heroes, then the villains must be collectivists. The first reason for that is because of the plot. That way your heroes have the most powerful and dangerous antagonist that the mind could ever struggle against, and you build the conflict of your story. You have the full enemy, the complete enemy, the most dangerous enemy, the most powerful, vicious, monstrously evil enemy the mind has ever faced. And you generate the kind of plot conflicts that Ayn Rand does in her stories. And then secondly, because of the theme, intellectual, you now expose in your story, intellectually, you expose the mind's worst enemy for the heinous evil that it is. And I think both because of plot considerations and the moral theme that Ayn Rand seeks to convey, her heroes must be, her villains must be the collectivists, not the religionists. This is why Ayn Rand's villains are and must be collectivists. And now we've answered the primary question of this talk. Thank you.